Okay, now it's time to Rob Burton about the use of Google Books. 10 minutes?
10 minutes.
Okay.
I've never spoken.
We will try. Okay, we will try to have a good discussion afterwards. Your time.
Okay. Thank you, Lourenzo, and thank you all for being here. It's been great to be invited. I'm thrilled and surprised, I think is how I would say it, when Bruno contacted me and said, would I like to speak, because I didn't think anybody was reading my papers. What I want to talk today is about the use of Google Books as a source of knowledge from agriculture and from historical agriculture. And this is something that has surprisingly, I think, not been picked up on very much since Mark and I wrote the paper in 2018. I had hoped that more people would start looking into this as a source, but I think it's probably quite daunting to start searching online for very old historical texts. Why look at traditional ecological knowledge? Well, it's being seen increasingly, particularly by ecologists, as this is a key means of gaining lost knowledge that industrial agriculture has eliminated effectively, and restoring biodiversity and introducing new climate resilience to systems. So there is potentially an enormous source of information out there. Google Books has digitized an awful lot of literature and an awful lot of old historical literature. So this is really what got me onto the issue. Well, I was reading stuff for the paper with Mark on hay meadows, and I think we'd done most of the paper by then. And then I was just reading about ecological use of traditional ecological knowledge, modern use, and came across this paper by Babai and Molnar from 2014. And they'd written about how farmers in Romania were applying burnt moss and spreading manure thinly over hay meadows in order to suppress moss growth. What got me in particular were the statements that it was not known from elsewhere, and that they believed it was caused by their deep embeddedness of the Kasango farmers with the local ecology. However, I'd just been busy writing a paper, and it reminded me that there were other mentions in the historical literature about the burning of moss, and in particular this Mortimer from 1708, where it suggests that farmers used the burning of moss to control moss growth. And I looked around a bit and found another one where they talk about thinly spreading manure over the meadows in order to retard the progress of moss. So what was actually happening in Romania was not something that had developed via this deep ecological knowledge of the farmers. This was something that had developed across the whole of Europe in history, but industrial agriculture had effectively wiped out a lot of this knowledge. A study in Sweden by Dahlström et al., looking again in comparison with the Romanian hay meadows, also said that the historical Swedish management was similar to management in Romania. What they argued was that the hay meadow management in Sweden had lost a lot of the smaller actions that the Romanian hay meadow managers followed, and one of those might have been the suppression of moss. So they argued that we should go to the Kasango farmers or the Romanian farmers and to try and fill in the gaps that have been lost over time for Sweden. There's been a recent paper, 2024, in Norway too, which has suggested that we should use historical texts to try and replace some of this lost knowledge within the agricultural systems that we have. But I mean, the main thing that struck me was that this wasn't evidence. The presence of small isolated groups performing these traditional ecological actions is not indicative of this connection with their environment. It's more evidence that there used to be a broad knowledge system spread across Europe, and if you look for what happened, particularly at the end of the 18th century, where there were a lot of wars and people were trying to increase the production of agriculture, that this knowledge could have been spread as part of a broader European knowledge information system. So I would argue that there is a lot of knowledge too, that when we look at these traditional hay meadow systems in Romania, for example, because they're there, because they're still there. But there's also knowledge that's actually been lost entirely from the system. Whole ways of farming have been lost. And one of them that I particularly like is the anthill pastures and meadows, because across England in particular, there were large areas covered with these pastures in the 1700s and 1800s. And the interesting part of this is that although the improvers, when they came in the late 1800s, late 1700s, although they tried to convince farmers to move away from it, it took almost 100 years before farmers were convinced that they shouldn't be removing the anthill meadows, that this traditional way of production was not best for them. Obviously, what the improvers wanted them to do was to flatten everything, fertilise it, and turn it into improved pasture. But why weren't they doing it? There were some suggestions in the literature. People thought it provided shelter for livestock during storms. There were rushes growing in between the anthill meadows, which some used for livestock bedding. There's a potential that it slows flooding in areas because obviously you have the resistance from the anthills, it's not just flowing over the surface. You have grass for livestock during drought because the area retains moisture more with the anthills around. And as a side issue, looking through the literature, there's a lot of mention about the bird species that live in there, like lapwings, green woodpeckers, finches and partridges. So it's actually quite a biodiverse environment as well, which clearly gave some of the authors a lot of enjoyment seeing all these animals in there. So what does an anthill meadow look like? This is an example. I dragged some from England where there are still anthill meadows. There are also anthill meadows across the rest of Europe as well, but they're very scattered and they're not, I think, seen as correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think they're seen as a particular type of management. I don't think this is a particularly dense field. There are stories in the literature of farmers jumping from the top of one anthill to another and crossing their entire field without stepping foot anywhere else. They love that. This is a sort of result of the anthills. Actually, the grasses on the top are generally believed, certainly with the reports of the improvers, to be less high quality than the grasses at the bottom of the anthills. And then the question comes in, well, is there other lost knowledge out there? And two that, again, I found in this review of literature. One was fogging, which is a practice in Wales of leaving hay standing in the winter rather than cutting it, and that has obvious advantages for the quality of the seed that's going on the land and various other aspects of it. That's gone completely. There's still mention of it in Wales and some parts of Wales, but it's not practiced. And then there's the lammas meadows, which at one stage, or lammas meadows, at one stage this was one of the four main types of meadow management in the UK, and what that involved was it's in private management until the hay cut, and then after the hay cut it became into public management. So it was a system where different groups controlled it at different times. Most of this has been lost in the oral traditional ecological knowledge, as Mark was talking about, is rather limited to a few generations, and maybe going back if you interview families, as Lourenzo was talking about previously, maybe you can go back to the last century, but you certainly can't go back as far as you can with the historical knowledge in Google Books. I'm not going to go into how to go into Google Books to find it. It's in the paper, but it's not particularly interesting. So I'm not saying that all of this knowledge is valuable. It's almost certainly not. If you're looking through the source, you will find a lot of information that is not important, but every now and again you find very significant papers, like ones that refer to a particular piece of land and give you from 200 years ago what was being grown on that piece of land and how it was being done. I even found one mention of a farm where they detailed the management practices on every field of the farm, and you could have traced that. So it's a treasure trove of knowledge, but it's very hard to find information that's of high importance. Google Books came along, established in 2002, and it sought to digitize all out of copyright publications, and I think they've completed the majority of key publications by now, certainly in the English literature and I think elsewhere. There are other sources as well, the Internet Library, the Biodiversity Heritage Library, and the Hathai Trust Library. You can also go and search those, but they're not as comprehensive as Google Books. So what sort of coverage do we get from these? Because of course it's no good if you're not getting much coverage. Well, I looked at Loudon's 1839 bibliography of British agriculture and found 67% of the publications in the 1500s, 44% in the 1600s, and 86% of his mentioned publications in the 1700s. And I found additional ones he didn't know about. And the coverage, as you can see from this, increases dramatically once we get past 1750. And this is because in the UK in particular, there were these attempts going on to industrialise agriculture. So they were recording, they were also, to some extent, eliminating this old knowledge that was sitting out there. This was part of the mandate of the British survey that they did in 1793 to 1820. They tried to gather the best knowledge and to improve it, but that meant they also had to report on the best knowledge and what was going on in the different areas. Things like the methods of producing hay, the types of machinery they were using, which was extremely diverse. I mean, they were just made locally and they had different variants of these. Of course, not all is roses with this. There are problems with the Google Books as a source. One of them is the fact that in many cases there's paraphrasing and plagiarism. So as a result, you don't know really when the activity took place. You can't be certain of its origins. In some cases, entire books were copied and given another name, which we can't do these days, unfortunately. There is a definite scientific agriculture bias. The best period to look at is probably the late 1700s, because in that period we had the scientific approach to analysing, but we also had the agricultural systems were still very traditional, so they were analysing the traditional systems of agriculture in that period. You have to read through the bias. A lot of it is about how do we make them produce more, which is just what we're doing now. It's not significantly different. One issue is the author's varying levels of agricultural knowledge, so we have everything from farmers to lawyers, as I say in the paper, in there, and you have to also consider whether the person writing it is actually able to judge the accuracy. It also means that they're likely to report different things, so a lawyer might report the economics of it, whereas a farmer might report what goes on the fields and makes it more valuable potentially. The final one is, it really occurs to you while you're reading this, is what the hell is traditional knowledge? Because are you reading back, like the oral history is 60 years, or is it traditional when you go back 300 years? Because if you go back 150 years, I would argue it's almost not traditional, because by that stage you can see, the more you read of this literature, you can see that things have changed dramatically since the late 1700s. I have a confession to make. One of the reasons I decided to come here is because I plan future research on this area and I need collaborators. So what I think we need to do now, because we know this knowledge is out there, it hasn't really taken off as a source, and I think ecologists in particular would be able to go, because it's so available, because it's so easily locatable. You can do it from your office anywhere, or your home. You can do it from any part of the world. You can locate information in any language, but we need to explore what is actually out there in order to make a case for why people should be using or shouldn't be using. We have to admit we may not find anything much these sources. So what I think we need to do first of all is to explore more languages and countries. As you saw in the diagram I had before, I've looked at England. Somebody's looked at Sweden. That's about it as far as I'm concerned. There are a lot more European countries. There are a lot more European languages. And if it was a traditional knowledge system that stretched across the whole of Europe, then there is bound to be more and valuable knowledge that also exists in the other literature. We need to look at a broader range of agricultural systems. Mark and I looked at hay meadows, but there's a lot of other stuff there. For example, flood meadows might be something with the problems Europe is having with floods now. A lot of meadows used to be flooded deliberately, and the possibility of bringing knowledge back to create flood meadows again is something that you could do using these sources. Another issue is how do we integrate it with oral traditional ecological knowledge, because what we have in Mark's case, I think it's much easier when farmers are following a system to get them to add to it than to get a farmer to create an entirely new historical system, because they aren't going to want to do that. That might be something that ecologists would do, but it's not something that farmers would want to do. So the idea would be that we'd have to work out how we can valuably combine these sources. There's also identifying the low-hanging fruit, which is an English expression. I don't know if it is in Spanish. But this means there is, as I say, there's very good stuff out there, but it's very sparse. So going through the literature relatively quickly and seeing if there's any really highly relevant, like very good descriptions of systems and very good descriptions of ecology or whatever. It does exist in this literature. I found it in the English literature. It must exist in other literatures in Europe too. To go out and find what is the important stuff that we can immediately use to address some of these issues with biodiversity and climate. Yeah, it's climate. Searching for climate resilience in systems, I think, is something that we could also do with these kind of sources and should probably look at. But then, possibly most of all, we need to evaluate how we can practically make this of use. Because it is no good, as I say, trying to get farmers to adopt entirely new systems. We have to evaluate, for example, what's the economic impacts of these, what are the ecological impacts of these, which is a much bigger process. Once we, or I at least, have got the attention of ecologists that this might be a useful source that they can also follow to add to the oral knowledge that they're already accessing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. We will try to continue our discussion in Galician language, Spanish, and now in English. First, I am so sorry because Miguel Cabo, who was the person to introduce and comment your paper, cannot be here because I told before he had an sport accident yesterday.
The extent some people will go to avoid me.
Then I have a lot of comments and a lot of questions, about your text, but I try to be very, very short in my intervention. Then, because I think that there will be a very strong discussion. But there is, you present here a very interesting instrument to look for the all farmers' organic practice, to look for the knowledge back. And we have a lot of interest in this, in your work, in this instrument, and we can collaborate in the future. Sure, I assure you. I promise you. But two questions. First, the question about traditional. Our problem, I think, that we have a very easy solution with dialogue, because there is not tradition, as you say. There is not when is defined the tradition. Everything is changing in the past, and everything is changing in landscapes. Everything is changing in seeds, in practicals, and so on. Then perhaps it's very easy to change the name, traditional for historical. Because history is change. Tradition is an ethnographic point of view from the present, and all the past is always the same. It's an ethnography question, and everything is always without change. This is the first point. Knowledge is constantly changing, as you say, as you wrote. And for me, this is one of the main points to change the epistemology of the question in agroecology and environmental science too. And the second question is in relation with the idea of revolution and agricultural revolution. Because if we need to change, and we need it, to change the future in this way, we need to change first the narrative about the past. And you use a lot of documents and books about the past. But perhaps we need to destroy first the conventional agriculture narrative. And the first point of this kind of narrative is the agricultural revolution. The first one, the second one, and the green revolution. It's a very old and heavy idea about that. And I mean, in order to understand this kind of books, and you have a very, very interesting and historical and critical approach, perhaps we have to reconsider the strong narrative of English agriculture, because, as you say, most of the writers, they are not farmers, and even the farmers are not really farmers. I mean, since Arthur Young, Lord Erne, at the end of 19th century, until Chambers and Mingay as historians, all of them write in the same direction. But we have alternatives, historical and geographical alternatives to this discourse, even in England. Alan Hawkins wrote in another direction about the reshaping of rural England, or I think that really quoted him, David Grieg, also wrote a lot about this question, and about this kind of questions, I mean. And perhaps, well, I think that we must make a discussion about these two questions. What is traditional? I mean, we cannot use the term traditional to speak to farmers. In fact, no. We have to change this way, I mean, and the narrative of agricultural revolution, English one, because it's the foundation of this idea. And I think it's better open the dialogue to everybody, and after a few interventions, you comment. Okay? Sí, hay dos palabras ya. Estefania?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Rob. I have a question about a concept that you used at some point towards the beginning, improvement, which is, I mean, it's a very interesting concept, a very English concept that I investigated a little bit how it was used back in the late 18th century and how it was understood and also used in different with different language in other contexts. But I was interested in the Polanyian approach of improvement as something that went against habitation, right? So seeing the whole agrarian improvement process as something that was against the people. So I was wondering, yeah, how do you use this? I mean, is this current English language improvement to understand, to mean what exactly? So what kind of improvement of what for whom? I was curious about that. Sorry, it's kind of a language question. And the other question is about Google Books. I mean, I come from a generation that was did most of our research in libraries.
Yeah.
So, but I was wondering, perhaps the Google tool allows you to do something that libraries don't, which is search for keywords.
Yeah,
and that makes a big difference, right? Because in my time, I had to read the whole thing before I could find perhaps one thing that I was interested in, and that took a lot of time and of course also money to go to the library that you need to be at. So,
exactly.
So does Google Books allows you to do that? Or are because sometimes when texts are digitalized, they don't allow searching.
Pasamos a otra, sí.
Yes, okay. So, my name is Alejandro Muro-Melenda. I am a postdoctoral researcher here at University of Compostela. So, my topic of my research is like improve the management of manure and slurry, as I was telling Mark, and I suppose you hear a little. So, and this is related to professors, but this my intervention. When I go and talk to farmers, I develop my own technology, I am talking about traditional techniques for managing this material, right? And it's not a despective term. When we talk about traditional techniques, we are talking about effective way of managing the material economically with a very good outcome. So I can use terms as ancient, traditional, conventional, using exactly the same meaning, okay? I'm going to continue my intervention related to what Rob was saying, okay? We lost this knowledge. We have heard now about Terra Petra in the Amazon, how they create this soil, highly productive soil with biochar, right? We lost this knowledge. And related to what the first speaker was saying, telling about the barriers of entrance of the neo-farmers, the new farmers, the ones that come from the city. It's not the barrier only, they don't have equipment, maybe they don't have land, but importantly, they don't have also even this knowledge, which can be a good chance for them to be as productive as other, maybe not as much, because if you go to this knowledge, to the highly productive dairy farm that I was talking to Mark, they might tell you, okay, we don't care that much what you are telling us. But these new people that are entering, and it's very competitive for them to enter, if you provide them with this knowledge, it is really helpful for them. What are your thoughts?
Añadimos una. Bueno, espera. Después.
Sobre o concepto de tradicional.
Después. Es que está escribiendo mucho, si no, no va a dar efecto.
What else?
A lot of questions for you. Yeah.
Do you want me to respond to that?
Yeah, you can.
Oh, yeah, okay. The question of what is traditional that's increasingly bothering me as I read through the information. And as far as farmers are concerned, you're absolutely right, as Mark also pointed out, is that they don't like to be referred to as doing anything particularly traditional. It's maybe it is possibly more of a thing of language, as you say. Perhaps we should move away. Historical won't help, however, because nobody wants to be seen as historical. You have to find some fancy word like eco-advanced, or you know, you have to create a word that actually implies movement forwards rather than backwards, because this is one of, I don't know about Spanish farmers, but in Britain this is one of the big sayings in farming: if you're not moving forwards, you're going backwards.
Yeah.
So you can't look backwards, that is just out. So yes, I agree as far as your comments about traditional is concerned. Maybe we need another word for it. As far as the agricultural revolution is concerned, I'm not a historian, so I'm not familiar with the sort of the analysis of the agricultural revolution that's gone on. It is interesting because I've been through almost all of the books from a certain period, whether at the end of the 1700 or all the ones that I had, and to see the transformation of knowledge, to see it move from effectively anecdotal pieces of wisdom, some of it absolute nonsense, from the mid-1700s to a much more scientific, and you can even see with some of the improvers like Arthur Young. Have you heard of him? He was, yeah. I mean, he was he wrote hundreds of texts, and he was very much in favour of scientific agriculture. At the time, he pushed it forward a lot. I'm not quite sure how to answer the question there, but it is a matter of going through these texts. As I say, you know, the comment that you made about some of them, you know, not being farmers, this is of course totally accurate, and you have to read not the text. As I was saying to somebody over the tea break, that if you set an AI to do this task, it would come up with absolute gibberish, because you cannot read the texts as what they are. You cannot assume that what they say is correct. You cannot assume that they're being fair to the traditional systems. You have to read between the lines, basically. Issues with the anthill meadows, for example, where, you know, if you read almost every report from the improvers, they're extremely critical of the anthill meadow. Oh, it does this, it does that, you just need to flatten it, and taking the anthills out, because of course the ants gather all the nutrients too around the anthills, so they're great if you break them up and you spread them out on the fields. And then there are reports of how this was done and the crop was magnificent immediately afterwards. No one says, well, what happens when you've used up the nutrients that the ants have stored, you know, in the next 20 years of the field's existence? Nobody goes and looks at that. But you have to read this information very, very carefully and look for the fact that there are numerous authors that mention these anthill meadows. There are various different reports, anecdotal reports from farmers about what they see as the anthill meadows being for. But then the other thing that I suggested too is that somehow we need to test these with ecologists to see if they actually do function or not. And we can't take historical knowledge for granted because of exactly the reasons you were saying. We need to test some of these ideas. What the definition of improvement is it against the people? Yes, probably. I don't think they had any particularly good intentions when they carried out the British agricultural surveys. The idea was to produce more food for the wars that they were having at the time. And it was a realisation, like in the Second World War where they had the plough-up scheme, it was a realisation that if they didn't produce more food, they were going to be in trouble. They were, population was going to suffer. So as I say, what they did is they went around and they looked at all the systems, and then I think it was supposed to be more about how you gather the best knowledge and repeat it, but it didn't tend to be. It tended to be more about improvement was increasing production. That was it, and that's the first sort of productivist, I suppose you could call it, approach. It was all about increasing production. And a lot of the things like again, going back to the anthill meadows, the fact that the farmers were able to use the rushes in order to create bedding for the animal didn't matter to the improvers. They didn't want to see that. They just wanted to see the grain coming off the fields and the animals coming off the fields and going into the cities. That's how I would describe the main objective of the improver movement at the time. And they missed a lot of stuff, I think, because of that. They weren't analysing properly what other uses farmers were making of the fields when they just looked at the production aspect. The best way of accessing Google Books, it's difficult to do it online. The problem is you have to, it's not a problem, but you have to download the books. You have to find downloadable versions of it. Otherwise, Google will take you where Google wants to and not where you want to go. So you have to find books that are relevant to you, or in the case of the British books, I followed the bibliography of Loudon and just went through it and searched for all the books, not just in Google Books, but in the other libraries as well. So the research process doesn't really begin until you have your own library accumulated on your computer. And then, what was I saying? So from there, if you have problems, for example, with, as you point out correctly, some of the sources are not digitized, some of them don't have readable text, and yes, absolutely, it is the ability to search that takes the historian out of the library, and it means that anybody, including me, can become a historian, because now I have access to things I never had access before. I can search, I wrote another paper on demonstration farms, and I downloaded sort of 500 sources, including journals from the 1800s, and I can search all of those with a press of a button, no problem.
But how about when they are handwritten?
You can't do handwritten stuff. That's the problem. But then I think you need to go to local sources rather than.
Yeah.
And maybe it is a case of locating some of these things first with Google Books. Maybe it's not the end to shouldn't be the end to the search for knowledge on these systems, but it might point you in the right direction or where you should be looking for it. But I think with the handwritten stuff too, that must be just as much a random matter of luck as to whether you find good information or not. I mean, I've bought a few farmers' diaries that were desperately disappointing because they were sort of pages of photocopies of handwritten notes that farmers from the 1800s had made, and they weren't, it was basically, did the ploughing today, today it was sunny, the lapwings were playing in the fields, that kind of thing. And you would need to go through an awful lot of handwritten stuff as well to find anything of use. The advantage of Google Books is you can go through hundreds of texts and you can do it instantly, but even that doesn't actually take you necessarily to the point you want to be. You can then use the key search text to find books that have that kind of comment in it, and then you can stretch using as I mentioned in the paper, using the desktop search, you can search for other aspects in there, or you might even just come across interesting articles that have tangential information, but not using keywords that you might have thought of. So it's a way of locating possible sources using the keywords, not as I say, what an AI would do is gather all the information about these keywords, and then it would stuff something together on the basis of that. It would be catastrophic. You really have to know these sources as well as knowing, as well as being able to locate them. Effective ways I wasn't quite sure what you were getting at with that question. Were you suggesting that there is other knowledge from outside Europe that is...
No, I think that what you're doing is very necessary. What do you plan to do with that?
What am I planning to do with it? I am planning to explore what we can do with it, because we're not at the point. We're not at the point.
That's where I go in. I can tell you what you can do.
I think we need to, we're at the very early stage of being able to use this, or this becoming a commonly used source. And as I say, what I hope is that ecologists and others who are interested in changing the current agricultural system, and that they can do it themselves, which is the advantage. Somebody like me going through as a geographer and reading information about how farmers used to practice things is no good if I don't understand the ecological implications of it. So what you want as ecologists to be able to, as part of writing a paper or studying a topic, is to just go through, okay, now I need to do my Google Books review and see if there was stuff available from that time. Okay, they may not do that. Most people are writing papers in as quick a time as possible, and this does involve rather a lot of work. But some might, and some might build up knowledge on the basis of that. It's a question, we could also do a study on how useful is this and find out that it's not useful at all, and that's fine. But if we just let it sit there while the world burns, literally, this would seem...
Even internet was not useful at the beginning.
And we need to look.
Hay duas palabras más. Anybody else?
¿Tenemos tiempo? Sí.
Sí. Porque si alguien más quiere. Tía Violeta.
It's about this discussion about the traditional ecological knowledge. Because we have a lot of discussion about this during many years. But recently in our project that we have with Gloria and with Enrique about recovering traditional ecological knowledge in agriculture and in fisheries in order to find ways to understand climate change from local traditional ecological knowledge. We have this discussion. As a starting point, I completely agree with Lourenzo's position that I am a historian. As a historian, traditional knowledge is not very useful because history is about change. And this local knowledge is constantly in transformation. For example, knowledge about crop rotations, about intercropping, the use of legumes, and so on. By other colleagues, for example, Gloria, but other ones, are arguing, I think that this is a strong argument, that for local communities today, for living, could be a paradox, but I think that is not a paradox. That for local communities today, this concept of tradition could be useful as a weapon to understand how to use this accumulated knowledge to make things today with problems as climate change or agroecological transition. So I think that could be a possible branch. Could be that this concept of traditional ecological knowledge could be useful if we are working with living local communities. But it's not that we are working with historical local knowledge because it's fixed, and they talk us about a process of constant change. Could be. But I think that this argument that the concept of traditional knowledge, traditional always is an invention. But this is not a problem, that this is an invention. All social discourse is an invention, but could be useful, I think.
It's related a little bit about the Google as, as a company that kind of and question it in a way that, of course, it is useful and we all use it and everything. But how much, you intend or kind of try to see that there is this lack of English, non-English languages books. So in a way, of course, because English is nowadays the like the kind of lingua franca in research and so on. But what is the risk of, for instance, some books in
I don't know, like indigenous languages or in other non-European languages to be introduced in there, and then after, you know, in a way we are talking about knowledge that might be, this is a question of the politics of knowledge as well. So I'm trying to kind of bring this uncomfortable thing that you have a company that is managing quite a lot of the knowledge we have, even our own lives, and it's nowadays producing these questions about privacy and so on, but we need to think a little bit as well about the question of the politics of this knowledge that might be at some point put in these archives, or rather we are trying to enhance the archiving in different institutions that might be better placed than in Google. I don't know. Is it just?
That's a good question.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry, I'm not very good at remembering things.
Me too.
Traditional ecological knowledge being useful with living communities. I really don't know enough to be able to comment on that. What I do know is that you don't talk to farmers about traditionality. It could be, there are other things in there too. I mean, I talk about farming and land management, but also there are things like recipes for cheeses, and some of them describe cheeses from England that although they exist in name, that the practice of making them has clearly changed over the years. In one case they made them all in mud huts because they believed they had a particular impact on the quality of the cheese, which could have interesting implications for not recreating local products, but for giving these things a new sort of legitimacy, if you like, in terms of their traditionality. I haven't really thought much beyond the farming communities on that issue. The question of Google Books and and what it does, and Google's role as part of the evil empire, which I am fully in agreement with. I think they are they have been in the past anyway, relatively good about just trying to dump everything into the archive. I don't think they've been very specific about what they've been doing. Whether they are particularly focusing on, for example, English, or whether they're looking at indigenous knowledges and indigenous languages, I don't know. But my guess is they're going to do the easiest stuff first. The problem comes then, this may not be deliberate on their part, the problem comes that the process is now slowed down, is that this was a major process certainly during the 2000s and 2010s, but I think increasingly some court battles have been had to try and keep the copyright of these books, even though they're 200 years old, in private ownership, because now people are trying to reprint them and sell them again, which you can do online relatively easily. So in a way, Google Books, by making them freely available to everyone, is annoying some people. So the process might have slowed down, but then maybe that's an opportunity for other organisations to take over. There are other organisations out there, and as I say, I wouldn't simply go to Google Books. What I do is I go to Google Books because it's the most comprehensive source, but I'll also search the Internet Archives and the Hathi Trust library and go through everything that's available. And gradually, I mean, the thing is, information isn't, well, God, this might be the famous last words. I was going to say information isn't going to be taken off the internet, but it probably will be at some stage or other. If things stay the same, then you're not going to have a decrease in the amount of information that's there. It's only going to build. I mean, for example, when Mark and I wrote our paper, I've since found numerous other sources from that period that weren't available when we wrote it, and that was only 6 years ago in Google Books. So I think maybe as time goes on, you will get access to an increasing variety of sources, but I understand why Google just went for the main libraries first. Apparently they were emptying books out of the libraries, putting them in trucks, taking them off, photocopying them and bringing them in. Literally at that scale, it was industrial. They don't seem to be interested in that much anymore.
Okay, I think that we can finish here now, and we pass to the last intervention. Enrique Tello and Valentin will make the comment.